Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Unusually for a Friday, Rob can't join us, and he told me at the last minute, so I couldn't get anybody else to fill in. So you are stuck with me. I hope the delicate tones of my bass voice are enough to educate you about what's going on in the world. Something that I will not talk about for the course of this podcast. I will not be talking about Donald Trump. I will not be talking about Stormy Daniels. I will not be talking about his jury. I will not be talking about his fines or his contempt charges. My God, American media, there is more happening in the world than Donald Trump and Stormy Daniels, and you are electing the man yourself by giving him uninterrupted 24/7 PR on all these major news channels. I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk to you about mostly today is the incredible and depressing flooding in Brazil, and maybe some thoughts for what that means for us in the United States and in other parts of the world. The flooding in Brazil, I didn't think much of it at the moment. I just thought it was it's a normal to see that kind of moisture in South America around an El Nino weather pattern. I didn't even log it in the CI Knowledge platform last week, because if I logged every single time there was a lot of rain somewhere in the world, that's basically all that I would be doing. But the situation has become extremely dire. And here's some statistics to sort of give you a sense of just how bad things are. The region that we are talking about here is the Rio Grande do Sul. And I apologize in advance, listeners, for my Portuguese. I don't speak Portuguese. We have some Portuguese listeners, not Brazilian listeners, but Portuguese listeners who I am sure, hopefully we have Brazilian listeners too, but I know that we have some Portuguese listeners. Feel free to write in and make fun of my Portuguese pronunciation. I Googled some of these things, but I know already that it's going to be terrible. But to give you a sense of just how bad things are in Brazil, starting last week, they've had rainfall exceeding, at least on average, 150 millimeters. So that's 6 inches of water. That's the average. In some regions, especially in the central strip of valleys, in plateaus, and in metropolitan areas, rainfall volumes have exceeded 300 millimeters. So that's 12 inches. And there are even some municipalities that are reporting volumes of over 500 millimeters. So we're talking 28, 30 inches of water in just over a week. That's an astounding amount of water in general. To put that into perspective, the Rio Grande do Sul has been soaked by 3 months worth of rain in just a couple of days. The scariest thing about this is that if you are reading Brazilian meteorological authorities and folks on the ground, they say the conditions are unlikely to abate for several weeks and could worsen. We're talking about the situation is going to be this bad until the end of May. Now, what exactly has happened? The rain has hit this part of Brazil, the Rio Grande do Sul. This is in the southern part of Brazil. You should get up a map if you want to understand where this is. And there's 3 main bodies of water that we need to focus on here: the Jacuí River, the Guaíba River, and then the Guaíba River dumps into the Lagoa dos Patos. I again apologize for my Portuguese. The Guaíba River has flooded, and the limit for the Guaíba River is 3 meters. Right now, the river has swelled to over 5 meters, and it's expected to be there until the end of May. So we're talking about floodwaters that are going to be present literally until the end of the month. And to add insult to injury, what's happening is you're getting rainstorms, and then you're getting cold fronts after the rainstorms. So on Monday, actually, the temperature dropped as low as 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So now you're worrying about hypothermia, in addition to all these floodwaters and all the things that come with floodwaters. And then there's going to be another rainstorm after that. So it's really just a terrible position. It's interesting geography here. The Guaíba River, it dumps into the Lagoa dos Patos. As I said, that's the largest lagoon in South America, and it goes right into the Atlantic Ocean. So we're talking about a river delta region. It's not surprising that this is a region that would struggle so much with flooding. And the pictures that you've probably seen, if you have seen them, is the capital of Rio Grande do Sul. It's Porto Alegre. And the pictures are just absolutely gut-wrenching if you're looking at what's going on there. There was one reporter on the ground who said that it's chaos, that she had never seen anything like it, that it was war was the word that she used to describe it, hopelessness, civil unrest, things like that. Also disturbingly, and this gets a little touching to my personal life here, there are reports in different suburbs of the city that patients are dying in critical care units because hospitals are losing power or are losing access to water. I'm obviously in New Orleans. My wife actually works at the hospital that the book 5 Days of Memorial tells the story of what happened to some hospitals in New Orleans around Katrina. I also think it's worthwhile bringing up Hurricane Katrina because Brian Winter, who is an analyst at America's Quarterly, and I think one of the best English-speaking analysts about Brazil and other parts of Latin America, He called this Brazil's Katrina in general. And there's a lot of similarities here, but I think the difference I've already sort of underscored here, we're talking about a situation that is not going to get resolved until the end of May. We're talking about floodwaters that are going to remain this high, continuing levels of storms that are going to soak the ground with more and more rain. Katrina was one major storm and then a failure of infrastructure and then fix things. This is a series of storms that's being kept in place by the El Nino weather phenomenon. You're getting snaps to cold weather and then you're going back to rain. Like this is going to exceed the challenge, I think, posed by Hurricane Katrina in that sense. The numbers right now are, I think they're going to get much higher, unfortunately. Over 100 people are dead, hundreds are missing. Roughly 250,000 people have been displaced, and about 1.4 million people in general have been affected by the flooding. There is basically no running water in Porto Alegre in some of these cities. Power is out for most of these areas. There was one funny anecdote of people grabbing sparkling water off of grocery shelves and bathing in sparkling water because that's the only water that was available to them. That actually sounds kind of interesting. I wouldn't mind. I wonder what bathing in a bathtub full of Topo Chico would feel like, but that's not what we're here to talk about. But anyway, just to underscore what an epic level of challenge is facing this region right now and that it really has not gone away. That's the human side of the equation. So I want to keep the human side of the equation in mind. If you are in the ag sector or are thinking about Brazil as the low-cost producer or the emerging low-cost producer for lots of crops like corn and soybeans, this is a big deal. Rio Grande do Sul produces about 70% of Brazilian rice, which is a major foodstuff in Brazil itself. The Brazilian government has already come out and said they're going to have to import rice and that they will import rice in order to keep supplies up. For the Brazilian market in general. This is the second largest soybean producing region in the entire state. There's also the port of Rio Grande itself has not been damaged by the flooding, but a lot of the rail connections and the road connections to the port itself have stopped operating. And that's forcing grain trucks to travel an extra 250 miles through alternative routes to reach the port. So you're increasing freight costs. There was also a local meat lobby said that they are trying to speed up delivery of feed and water supplies to chicken and hog farms in the area. And they said that there's an unspecified number of animals that have already died due to the flooding. I don't think we're going to get clarity on what those numbers look like for quite some time. But aside from how many animals have died, just think about the potential for disease, not to mention all the infrastructure that has to be rebuilt and things like that. So we're looking at a major agricultural disaster and something that could affect global agricultural trade if the waters stay as high as some of these Brazilian agencies are warning about right now. Lula has visited twice the region, and the reports about what he saw, I mean, just how sort of shocked he was at the scale of the destruction. He also had some very pointed comments that he made sure were in English and went to U.S. and other English language newspapers. He talked about Brazil needing to stop running from disaster to disaster, preparing for disasters before they actually happened. But he also blamed what is happening in Brazil on the failures of the global community to respond to climate change. He said that there was a historic climate debt, that poorer countries that have historically emitted fewer greenhouse gases are suffering from the pollution of wealthier nations. Now, some of you, that's going to set your politics off immediately. You're going to light yourself on fire. Remember, I'm not here to talk about whose politics are right or not. I'm just telling you the president of Brazil is using that. He is saying, look, this is not necessarily our fault, and the rest of the world owes Brazil something because we are suffering from all these emissions and things like that came. He also told the Washington Post in particular this was the third record flood in that same region of the country, and that the world needs to prepare every day with more plans and resources to deal with some of these occurrences. So Brazil has already been talking this way, and Lula has tried to present his presidency as one that is more in touch with the environment, whether that's protecting the Amazon from deforestation, whether that's thinking more about renewable forms of energy, whether that's dealing with climate disasters and things like that. But he has a really tremendous crisis on his hands right now. And I think there's two other things that I sort of want to put in mind about this. The first, and I live in New Orleans. I didn't live through Katrina. My wife lived through Katrina, so I've heard some of her stories. But it's remarkable what died in Katrina and what didn't die in Katrina. So New Orleans is a really important geopolitical city for the United States, and it was always going to be rebuilt because of how important it is to U.S. agricultural trade and access to the Gulf of Mexico and to global trade routes and things like that. But I have the sense, having that New Orleans changed irrevocably as a result of Katrina. There's pre-New Orleans Katrina and post-New Orleans Katrina. And that's sort of in keeping with the history of the city of New Orleans. It's been destroyed and rebuilt many times. I think that is actually one of the things that gives it its unique character. It's a bunch of different sort of cultures and creations smushed together. And that's probably going to be true for any port city or any city that is overly exposed to these types of climate disasters. So Porto Alegre, like that city, is probably never going to be the same. And the Rio Grande do Sul is probably never going to be the same. Now, the question is, can Brazil turn this catastrophe into opportunity? Many of you ask me what I think about Peter Zeihan, and this is not the place to go deep into that. But I think one of the areas where I differ most from Peter and from other geopolitical analysts is I am incredibly optimistic about Brazil's future. And one of the reasons I'm incredibly optimistic about Brazil's future is the scale of the infrastructure they have built throughout the country over the last 5 to 10 years. One of Brazil's big problems is that as a result of its difficult geography, it needs a lot of expensive infrastructure in order to create economies of scale so it can export its commodities and connect the disparate regions of the country into one whole. It's begun doing that. And I think you can see in Lula laying out that blame on the international community and things like that. I think he's thinking about, well, how can I get a bunch of money into Brazil to build even more infrastructure here? And I hope that when Lula is thinking about rebuilding these parts of southern Brazil, that he does not do what New Orleans did, that he does not just try and build water pumps and try and get the water out of the city, but that he looks more towards how the Dutch have decided to live with water and other societies that when they live around water, they bring the water as part of their life. And they build structures that allow for water to rise and fall because there's going to be more of this. There's going to be more flooding. There are going to be more extreme weather events. El Nino is going to cause worse flooding. There's probably going to be worse drought on the other end too. So I really hope that Brazil is able to take this crisis, this catastrophe, and turn it in to an infrastructure investment property, even a way to be at the forefront of how do you re-engineer these cities that are at river deltas, that are on the coast, that are important economically, but which can't function the way that they used to in the context of climate change. How can you live with water? How can you prepare for these sorts of disasters? It's a very tall task, but if there's any country that is facing this that might be capable of doing this sort of thing, I think Brazil has the right government, the right perspective. It's at the right stage of its development. All of those things sort of line up for Brazil to do that. So I will be really interested to see not just how resilient Brazil is, but how innovative it is in tackling this problem. Because if they just try and put lipstick on the pig and go back to life as usual after the waters eventually recede, that would be a reason to be more skeptical about Brazil's future. Because if Brazil is going to succeed, if it is going to finally become the country of the future that it has joked it's always been, it needs to adapt to the changing environment and to all the things that are causing pressure for it in general. So those are Brazil's floods, something really important to think about, especially if you're in the ag space, especially if you're thinking about ag markets. It also offers a really interesting sort of base case for how to think about climate change and living with water in general. I want to move on from there and talk a little bit about the application of some of these things, in particular to the United States, because that's where I am. But I think that these insights can be applied in other places as well. I joked that we have some Portuguese listeners. I was struck when I was in Lisbon last September at the similarities between Lisbon and New Orleans. And I think there are parts of Europe that face very similar situations like this. We talked about this in the context of Indonesia on the podcast a couple of months ago as well. So Brazil is not alone here. And I think there are some insights that we can pull out here. In March, I was in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was hanging out with one of our frequent podcast guests, Elohim Monard. And I was complaining that my homeowner's insurance rates in New Orleans were increasing. And he laughed at me and he said this was such an American or a first world problem. Elohim is from Peru. And he said in Peru and other places like this, we don't have this thing, insurance. Like you buy something and you take on the risk. You can't pay somebody else to manage the risk for you. But in the United States, if you own property, you can't think of not owning homeowner's insurance. If you have a mortgage, you're required to have a homeowner's insurance in general. And Rob and I have talked a little bit about this on the podcast, and he was supposed to talk a little bit more about it here. But I have a couple of statistics that will tell you just how bad the situation is for the insurance market in the United States in general. Overall, nationally, between 2021 and 2023, homeowners insurance rates have increased almost 20% in the United States in general. I was going to quiz Rob to see if he knew which states saw the largest increase in homeowners insurance in the country. I'm going to give you the top five. Louisiana, number one, woohoo, a 63% increase from January 2023 to January 2024. Number two, this one surprised me, Nebraska, a 61% increase. Number three, Colorado, a 49% increase. And then rounding out the top five is Arizona and Utah. Other places that are sort of lower on the top 10, Illinois at 6, the District of Columbia at number 7, and then North Dakota, Arkansas, and Kansas rounding out the top 10 here. I was shocked that California was not at the top of this list. This list, by the way, is from real estate company Redfin. They were the ones that were compiling all of this data. That is a shocking increase in the cost of homeowners insurance in general. I was curious how many homeowners will forego homeowners insurance. Now, like I said, if you have a mortgage, you can't go without homeowners insurance. And that might mean that people can't afford their houses in the long run. Because if rates continue increasing like this, I don't care about the green shoots in wages. Like wages are not increasing enough to account for this kind of increase in homeowners insurance. But according to the Consumer Federation of America, about 6 million homeowners in the United States forego homeowners insurance. So these are people who own their houses outright and for whom getting homeowners insurance is either impossible or they don't want to pay the cost. That's about 7.4% of all homeowners in the United States, and it represents about $1.6 trillion of unprotected value. If these rates keep on going up like this, I think that number is going to increase in a major way. And that is not a big problem until you get a Hurricane Katrina-like event or until you get a Brazil flooding type event. Because all of that unprotected real estate and things like that, who is going to rebuild it? Are cities going to raise taxes? Are states going to levy taxes? Is the U.S. government going to go in and helicopter money in there? I don't know. You might remember over a year ago now when the United States was talking about a previous Ukraine weapons package to support Ukraine's war against Russia, there was also a water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. And it was something like the U.S. government was going to give Jackson, Mississippi, I forget the exact number. I think it was something like $12 million, but they were going to give $200 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine. And the U.S. government has not shown that it's willing to come in and bear some of these costs in general. And I worry that for some of these places that are risky, and even places that aren't risky, if you do get some kind of disaster, the cost of rebuilding might be prohibitive, or maybe you're going to see places that are just going to empty from people because of these insurance rates in general. That's before we get to the health of insurance companies and whether they can bear the cost of these things. Now, there is something sort of off about these insurance companies increasing rates by that much in places like North Dakota. I mean, I know that there are risks in North Dakota. There are risks everywhere. But if you look at sort of the cost of building materials, all these other things, they've gone down since the really, really sharp spikes after the COVID-19 pandemic. So I get a little bit of the feeling, if you remember when you used to not have to pay for bags on airlines, and there was none of this choosing your seats or upgrading for a little bit more legroom, things like that. And then in the context of the late 90s, early 2000s, they started implementing that stuff, and it's been off to the races ever since. I get a weird nagging feeling that insurance companies are sort of like this. They had these disasters. They used that as a justification for charging higher rates in general. The flip side of that being, if you sort of trust them, well, when they get a sort of Brazilian flooding type event, that's going to put them out of business, even if they have raised rates that much. It's not the sort of thing that you can prepare for, and none of their actuarial tables or their experience is going to fit in a world where these types of disasters are going to get worse, where, looking at what has happened in a particular region, 5, 10, 50, over 100 years, maybe that data is not as good as it used to be because of how rapidly things are changing. And this is always sort of true, but when you look around the world, we talked about the heat wave last week in Southeast Asia. We have this flooding in Brazil. There's always some kind of the earthquakes in Taiwan, which were scaring the crap out of me. You also might remember that Rob predicted an earthquake in Manhattan unintentionally here on the podcast as well. So you start to put all these things together. There's just a lot of risks out there, and I think a lot of challenges for thinking about insurance companies, whether to invest in insurance companies, whether to invest in real estate, if you own your home, whether you should be paying these levels of insurance. I think the way we own homes and the way we think about insurance is probably going to change in a meaningful way here. And we're getting in some ways a front row seat for thinking about that conversation with what's happening in Brazil, because I guarantee you, this is not just a story about Brazil. Things like this are going to happen in the United States. They already have. They're going to happen in places like China. They're going to happen in places like the United Kingdom or Japan and things like that. These types of disasters have always been with us. They're just going to get worse and more frequent because of some of the changes that are happening in the environment in general. All right, like I said, those are not completed thoughts, but I just wanted you to get a sense of what is happening in Brazil. And I wanted to give you a sense of how we're thinking about it here at CI, how I'm even thinking about it in my own personal life, and how these are questions that you should be thinking about yourself when you're thinking about your own real estate assets or you're thinking about your exposure to climate change and risk in general. Before we close, I wanted to just give you a smattering of other things that are happening in the world. I always say that I'm optimistic and that things are better in the world than they seem to be. And then I get on here and talk about how apocalyptic climate change is coming for us all. But there's a couple of things that came across my desk that I also thought were interesting that I wanted to share with you. The first, this is from The Economist. The Economist had a rare article that opened my mind a little bit. You might know that we were bullish cocoa futures over a year ago now. We thought that the price of cocoa was going to increase markedly. We didn't like some of the things we were reading about growing conditions in Western Africa. We didn't like some of the things we were reading about the EU requiring stringent new regulations for sourcing some of their cocoa in general. And you put that together, we thought cocoa was going to increase. We had exposure via an ETN to cocoa futures, but they shut down that ETN about, I forget, it was 6 to 7 months ago. And of course, ever since they shut it down, the price of cocoa has gone absolutely to the roof. So if you like conspiracy theories, there's something in there. And we've been disappointed that we got some of the upside, but not all of the upside. But The Economist had an article about how Latin American farmers are thinking about cashing in on these high prices, that even the El Nino weather cycle that is causing all of these problems in South America might actually lead to some changes that could allow some of these Latin American countries to grow more cocoa. Ecuador and Brazil have talked about growing more. Peru, Colombia, and the Dominican Republic are also talking about growing more in general. Brazil was actually the world's largest grower until a fungal disease there in the late 1980s and early 1990s killed their crop. But in 2023, they unveiled a plan to produce 400,000 tons by 2030, which is up from 290,000 in 2023. Ecuador is looking to double its production by 2030. Now, this is not necessarily what Latin American countries need. They don't need to find more cash crop commodities that they can sell into developed markets. We've seen over and over again how that actually doesn't increase the wealth of those countries in general. And the problem for countries in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, is that they become these commodity houses where outside powers that are wealthy come in, take their commodities, they spend a little bit of money, but it doesn't actually change things. But I did think that was interesting in the context of global cocoa trade. It was something to keep in mind. I also had it in mind because coffee prices have begun to soar as well. And coffee is another one that we've had exposure to here in our CI macro strategy. But international prices for Robusta coffee reached new highs based on, you guessed it, unfavorable weather in Vietnam, but also based on massive demand for durian. So durian is crowding out some Vietnamese coffee growers because they can get more for selling durian into China than they can growing coffee in general. And that was the other thing I wanted to say about the coffee market that was so interesting. China right now is the seventh largest consumer of coffee in the world, consumes about 5 million bags, each about 60 kilograms a year. That's behind Canada, the Philippines, and Japan. It's only slightly above Indonesia and Russia. So China, very, very early in its taste for coffee. It makes sense. Tea obviously comes from China, so it's a tea-driven society, but it has been increasing markedly. And if you look at Chinese coffee consumption compared from 2009 or 2010 today, it's increased by almost fivefold, even more if you go back to before 2008. So this is one of those areas where China's demand is really affecting global markets. And we've seen this before with industrial commodities, but we haven't quite seen it with coffee. And that's something that's changing in general. And one of the things that might be driving up the cost of coffee, in addition to durian demand and Vietnamese weather and other things like that. So I thought that was interesting. And I'm really curious if China makes the move towards becoming a coffee drinking society. I told you they were the seventh largest consumer. I thought it was interesting that the top consumers are the EU, the United States, and then Brazil, Japan, and the Philippines. India not even on this list. So interesting to think about which countries drink coffee and culturally why they drink coffee and other things like that. I'm sure that somebody's done a whole thing on that, and I'm only just learning this for the first time. But I thought that was interesting as well. Last but not least, I wanted to say a couple things about, or I should say, one of the things that really struck me this week were two reports in Mexico. AMLO does the president of Mexico, who's on his way out. He gives these daily press briefings, which are for the most part nonsense. But he got asked about why he went back on a campaign promise about the militarization of Mexican security in response to the cartels. And he gave a remarkably honest answer to the question. He said he turned to the military because the country that he inherited was in catastrophe, and the things that he wanted to do, he couldn't do. He called himself a Juarista and a civilista, but he also said that he was Mexican and that he had a task, which was to transform the country. And I'll quote him now here, translating what he said in Spanish. I found myself in a catastrophic reality, and precisely because of corruption, I was not going to be able to get out of it if I did not rely on the armed forces, which I was also lucky in that they were not ruined. There were other government departments completely dedicated to corruption, so I had to go with the army and took advantage of what we had. I do not believe that the ends justify the means. I do believe, though, that in politics, in some cases, what counts are the results. So my recognition to the armed forces, they have helped us a lot with a lot of sacrifice because that is also forgotten. That's a remarkable sense of self-reflection on his own government. AMLO made waves when he was running for office about hugs, not bullets, about trying to legalize the drug trade, about trying to deal with the cartels in a different way, and he hasn't. As he sort of said there, he had to rely on the military to enforce a greater sense of security. He's creating a national guard from the military ranks because he doesn't trust the police forces to go after some of these cartels. The homicide rates have plateaued. They haven't gone down. They aren't increasing as they were sort of in the early years of his presidency. I don't know whether you can call that a positive or a negative. But I really don't have a take. I just thought it was a shocking degree of honesty from an outgoing president about a promise that he made, a promise that he had to renege on, and what's going to happen to the future of his country in general. The other thing that struck me about Mexico was there was a report from their main ministry that covers this, that according to a bunch of different indicators, Mexican households are worried about inflation over the next 12 months. And I am really curious how Mexican economic sentiment about inflation is going to affect the upcoming election, is going to affect Mexico-U.S. relations in general, if that's something that Mexico is going to be worried about in its dealing with the Biden administration, with the new president, and whoever wins in the United States in the next election. It's also interesting when thinking about, are we seeing a sort of broader turn to higher prices across the world? We have talked here at the podcast ad nauseum about how we think that U.S. inflation was always going to surprise to the upside, and it absolutely has. And now we're sort of, well, is it going to continue to surprise to the upside? Have we called it correctly? Do we need to now take the contrarian point of view? I was surprised to see a lot of these different indicators and a lot of sentiment in Mexico saying that they think inflation is going to increase over the next 12 months. And one of the key reasons I want that in your minds is because even though Claudia Sheinbaum, who looks to be the odds-on favorite to win the Mexican election, even though she's behaving like more of a pragmatist, and I don't think that she will be as unorthodox, let's put it diplomatically, as AMLO was in her governance of Mexico in general, that's not going to be true if you see a huge increase in the price of energy or the price of food in Mexico. It's the increases in food prices that brought AMLO his political power in the first place. As I often say to audiences when I speak to them, I always show them a price of the tortilla price index in Mexico, going back to right after the United States decided that ethanol was going to be a part of the U.S. energy matrix. And tortilla prices in Mexico go to the roof. And that's exactly when AMLO came of political age, when he started articulating his populist views about how Mexico needed to be self-sufficient in food production in general. So if we are about to see an increase in Mexican food inflation and in energy inflation and things like that, it would underscore why I'm so nervous about Mexico-U.S. relations, which again is another thing that we are not talking about because we're talking about nonsense every time we turn on the television or open a newspaper. But I said I wasn't going to talk about that, and I'm not going to talk about that. That's 30 minutes of time talking with me about geopolitics, about the flooding in Brazil, about coffee and cocoa, and about Mexican inflation. We've got a great podcast coming up on Monday with Dale Copeland about U.S.-China relations. Rob and I will be back at it, and we're going to add some interesting content here over the next couple weeks and months. Last but not least, listeners, if you filled out that survey that I asked you to fill out last week, thank you so much. You guys came through in monumental fashion, as I knew that you would. I sit here and I speak into the microphone, or I look into the screen when I'm talking with Rob or our other guests. And sometimes you can get the feeling that you're just beaming thoughts out into the ether and you don't know who's out there. But anytime I've ever asked for anything from you guys, you always come through, and can't tell you how good it makes me feel to know that there's a community out there that actually cares about what's going on in the world, and is willing to listen to me figure out and try and think and talk about what's going on in the world. So thank you very much. Glad to have you along for the ride. We will be back on our normal cadence next week. Take care of the people that you love. Think about your homeowner's insurance. Cheers, and see you out there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.